Здравствуйте. Я очень рада, что вы сегодня пришли. Как вы знаете, в музее сейчас проходит выставка Никиты Кадана, которая называется «Означені». Она посвящена травматической памяти, травматическим воспоминаниям и исторической памяти. Но в рамках этой выставки мы проводим достаточно широкую, продолжительную образовательную и лекционную программу. Партнеры нашего проекта – это Центр городской истории Восточно-Западной Европы, который находится во Львове, а также историческое сообщество Hubspot History, руководитель которого Оксана Долгополова, и, конечно, мы, Музей современного искусства. Лекция Джессики открывает череду лекций, дискуссий и различных событий в рамках этого проекта. Завтра, если вы заинтересованы в выставке, мы вас приглашаем на 4 часа на экскурсию Джессики по второму этажу нашего зала. Хочу вам представить нашего лектора. Это исследователь, антрополог, который занимается вопросами гендера, медиа, литературы и искусства. Сегодня достаточно интересная лекция. Из какого города? Да, это канадский исследователь из города Альберти. Окей. И сегодня лекция посвящена образом из творчества Бруно Шульца и Никиты Кадана, картины, которые вы сегодня видите. Я бы, возможно, обратилась к комментарию Никиты, который он сегодня опубликовал в Фейсбуке, и несколько раз делал на нем акцент во время экскурсии, что ему задают вопросы, как это так? Никита Кадан и Бруно Шульц вместе, да, в одной лекции. И кто такой Никита Кадан, кто такой Бруно Шульц? Конечно, Никита называет себя пылью и мальчиком, пытающимся рисовать рядом с Бруно Шульцем. Мы ему позволим эту скромность. Но мне очень понравилась его мысль о том, что здесь не существует иерархии. Здесь не существует иерархии, и мне очень интересна оптика Джессики, которую она сегодня предложит, анализа писателя и художника Бруно Шульца и художника, и очень интересного, можно сказать, публициста, да, критика современной культуры Никиты Кадана. И я рада, что вы сегодня здесь. Я передаю слово Джессике.
So, thank you for attending this lecture tonight. Thank you for inviting me to Odessa, this historic city of literature and art and ideas. I am honored to speak about Bruno Schulz because his surroundings were actually a huge part of my formation in choosing to become a scholar. Before I earned my PhD, I was living in Zambia, not far from Rehovich, working as a school teacher in the same institute connected to Bruno Schulz's institute in Rehovich. And while living there, I started to explore the surrounding area, and I discovered a masquerade in the city limits, within the city limits of Zambia. There seemed to be no discussion of this grave throughout the city. I kind of stumbled upon it by accident, and it changed me and started me on this path of research, which I am still on today. One of the scholars that I've worked with for several years is Джессіка, and I will be referring to some of her ideas tonight because she has become formative for thinking about how these sites, masquerades, are remembered she wrote a book called The Crosses at Auschwitz, which traced the national debates in Poland around the memorial of a cross placed on a Jewish site. She recently has been working with scholars around the world on the Poland Museum in Warsaw. And to come out of my conversations with her around that exhibit, she and other scholars and I are working with this idea of a national sensorium, of nationalism. How nations, Poland, Ukraine, Israel especially, who meet in this place, Sambir of Drohobych, define themselves vis-a-vis one another. Another scholar who I've worked with quite a bit is Benjamin Palop, and he wrote an essay called Who Owns Bruno Schulz? Schulz is a figure as much about nation in our contemporary time as he is an author and a poet and an artist in his own right. So he is placed in this border zone of national sensoriums, of these nation-making processes that happen, as we heard earlier from Natalia, through hierarchies of meaning. I think one of the gifts that we have in this exhibit tonight in Kadan's work is a complete break with that hierarchy. This exhibit and the themes here, which I will get to tonight, both depart completely from Bruno Schulz, yet also engage with that space of 1941 when Schulz was shot, and the history of life in small town Galicia, and also the city of Lviv. So what is this idea or concept of nationalism that I'm working with? We have also a sense of the everyday in Schulz's work. So let's go to 2 slides ahead. One more. Here is a picture from the book of Idolatry. This woman is obviously very stylized, and she's posed in a way that suggests great pride, great dignity. And many of Schulz's works, this one included, almost all of his drawings of women are unnamed. They remain titled as here Infanta or Bacchanalia or idols. They have goddess-like features. Jerzy Fitzowski has remarked before that what we have here is a writer in Schulz who draws rather than a drawer who practices writing. His characters are standing in for ideas in his work. The surroundings are usually very banal. The street scenes constantly repeat over and over the everyday lives of Galicians through lots of small houses you'll see in the backgrounds of his paintings. But the figures, the expressions are where he draws his technical mastery and shows our attention to these spaces. So more than indifference or arrogance, these female figures in Schulz are standing in for his theories of myth and language. He calls them she idols, and in my longer text I spend quite a bit of time looking at Schulz's theories of these she idols. If we think about photography, which Kadan's paintings are coming out of images he did not invent himself. These are photographs taken by casual passerby who were invited to commit violent acts of atrocity on their neighbors. a drawing is a completely different medium and does not have the same sense of evidence that a photograph has. So the sensorium, the national ideas, the experience of a photograph that is now iconic in Kadan's paintings is what situates him in the same space as Bruno Schulz, as a border between nations, because these photographs already are circulating in Poland's myth of itself. And what I mean by that is that in a lot of Polish art dealing with Jewish memory, you have constantly the theme of loss. And you have the theme of lost territory, especially because the Polish myth of Drohobycz and this whole region is called the Kresy myth. The Kresy in the Polish nation-building ideology is a lost space. And in Polish art, you have right now, in this contemporary period, this constant idea of bringing back the Jew in order to restore a multicultural Poland. So this myth of loss works on different levels in the Polish case. In other nations situating themselves vis-a-vis these photographs of 1941, we could look at a totally different view from the post-Soviet space of the victims of fascism being also unnamed victims. That in Russia, for example, you have this much stronger Ruski Mir myth, and 1941 becomes about victims to fascism. It's not about loss and building a multicultural Russia. It's very different from the way Poland has incorporated these images into their nation myth. So by bringing together both this concept of unnamed in Schulz and his myth, and the unnamed victims in Nikita's paintings, we are pointing towards new territory and open territory for how Ukraine specifically wants to approach its own history and its past in this moment. Because we have a lot of information, a lot of evidence that Ukrainians were very involved in the killings at the prison sites, and so were Poles. Poles were also involved and were even disguising themselves as Ukrainians while taking part in the mass violence. John Paul Himka has written a lot about this moment of the pogrom and the theories of spontaneity around it to undo the fact that it was completely spontaneous, because it was not. There were groups orchestrating attacks prior to 1941. In 1939, in Krakow, you also had a pogrom, so it was right before the 1941 attack. You have the NKVD murders in Lviv that radicalized the population, created a lot of anger, and primed people for the attacks on one another. But part of the history in Lviv is also connected very closely to art itself, because you had this figure, Felix Landau, who was part of the CC Eisensgruppen, and he was orchestrating a lot of the killings in Lviv. He wrote in his diaries that he killed 500 Jews in one day on July 1st, 1941, at the height of the pogrom. And what he did was worked closely with leaders of OUN-B, Stepan Bandera's group, and this his group Nachtigall is still under trial. It has not been completely documented or proven that they were indeed carrying out all of the atrocities that are levied against them. However, they have been on trial in 2001, 2003, and 2007 in Berlin. Those investigations have been discontinued due to lack of witnesses, but part of their activities were to compile lists of Polish intelligentsia and specifically professors in the city of Lviv to both put down any sense of Polish nationalism, but also to acquire their wealth and their apartments, especially those apartments by leaders such as Kazimierz Bartel, who had been the prime minister of the Second Polish Republic. He was the first arrested on July 6, 1941. But basically, Felix Landau collected art, and he wanted art from the Polish intelligentsia and from Jews. So he, in the process of the pogrom, was very systematically acquiring wealth. Not far away in Drohobych at this time, he was protecting Bruno Schulz. Bruno Schulz was his personal artist, working to paint the very famous nursery paintings in his Felix Landau's apartment in Drohobych. Now, what is interesting is that in the end, after the violence had ceased, Felix Landau and the other members of his group actually used the Polish markets to sell the same paintings they had stolen. So the violence was cyclical and orchestrated, even though there was a moment of complete spontaneity. And the currency of art was used against artists. And why am I pointing all of this out? Well, because in revisiting the famous question of should there be art after Auschwitz by Theodor Adorno, and also in thinking about our own engagement with these paintings, we cannot assume responsibility on audiences. We cannot assume that viewers will come to this room and not be voyeurs, not look for violence. I was at a conference recently in which we were discussing genocide. And this was at University of Toronto, hosted by the Monk School of Global Affairs and the University of Massachusetts Amherst Center for Holocaust Studies. There was a Holocaust survivor in the room. It was a woman, and she stood up and she said, I deliver many talks at schools and universities. It's my way of dealing and coping with the past. And I never want the question being, were you raped? She said she's always asked this question as a woman survivor of the Holocaust. Now, what is important is that in this room of many different historians who had been writing about Jewish memory and Jewish history for many decades, they all agreed that historians thus far have failed to account for sexual violence in writing the story of the Holocaust. That's part of why this question is always asked to survivors, because it has not been approached in the literature and in the history in a way that really grounds the point that the fundamental form, the most basic form of the replication of violence is through sexual violence and through this lens, we can understand that moment in a completely different way. And what I think is important and interesting about Kadan's paintings is that he selected these images himself, and he included the women. He could have not included them. He could have omitted all female images and only focused on male suffering. So by inclusion, it is including the female suffering alongside the men and giving equal measure to both, because if you even go through the rooms and in every room you'll find a woman. Including this is a radical act and a move forward in the historiography, I think, of the Holocaust and of the pogroms. So starting there, we can then look back and unfold out of these images stories of these women. Because in writing about victims, we don't want to erase the person. They may be unnamed here, but these were real people. And we cannot allow for women, especially when we're talking about sexual violence, for women to become a tabula rasa, to become the ultimate victim. Because if we do that, then we allow the voyeurs to find some perverse pleasure in their viewing, and this is not the replication of systems of violence that we want silence to achieve. So, unfolding out from these images a sexual history of Lviv is interesting and important because there was a very live and powerful culture of performance, of cabaret, of women who owned their own salons, who wrote. Deborah Vogel was a major literary figure and one of Bruno Schulz's inspirations. And if you're interested, the journal Prosti has recently published her works in translation in Ukrainian. And it's not a coincidence that Nікіти Kadana is on the editorial board of Prosti, so there's another connection here. But let's look at Bruno Schulz's works. Again, a little bit more, I think, in more depth. So if we can go to the next slide. Here you see the streets of Lviv. Again, we are in the same space as the paintings. The streets become a place of violence in this image. Often Schulz puts himself into his own pictures. So you see him here, kind of off to the side, looking at the soldiers with a little bit of apprehension. Let's go to the next slide. This is another image from the book of idolatry. And you can really see the reversal, the role reversal here of power, the women being these queenly figures. Let's go to the next slide. This is also important, I wanted to tell you guys. This particular image is interesting because it is entitled Ungala Among the Artists. And it really captures Bruno Schulz's theories about drawing and about his interactions with the themes of language, because he himself was writing a lot about how every word we use is part of a larger myth. Almost like a statue that has been broken into many pieces and is trying to rebuild itself into a statue. So he was thinking about the strand of philosophy called phenomenology, about how shapes how forms can be metaphors for language. And I will get to that some more, but let me quote what he was writing. He says, "The drawings were full of cruelty, pitfalls, aggression. It was enough if a drawing, pinned down by the tip of my pencil, made the slightest move to escape, for my hand trembling with new impulses and ideas to attack it like a cat. Fierce, I would, with lightning bites, savage the creation that tried to escape from beneath my. And that crayon only left the paper when the dead corpse displayed its colorful anatomy on the page, like a plant inside of an herbal or glass house." So he, in his writing, is always struggling with this border: pain, pleasure, self, other, domination, submission. The struggle between these binaries sheds light on his idea that art reflects a mythic secret entrusted to individual artists, in which the secret stays in a tangle. He writes, "The knot of the soul is tied up, not a false one that comes undone when you pull it, but it draws tighter. We handle it, we trace the path of the separate threads and look for the end. And out of this manipulation comes art." His theory here is very Baroque. The profane becomes a source of creation. The death of some animal that feels pain and fear is transformed into new flora, new flower. Schultz turns death into rebirth and life. In acknowledging this, he talks about the limit of language as a source of suffering. And this suffering justifies the artist's individual suffering. He wrote a lot about his own suffering. So modern understandings of the term masochism, and I'm not the first to write about masochism in Bruno Schulza. There have been others, if you're interested. David Goldfarb is one of the scholars who writes in this terrain. But modern understandings think about, a psychological category, a diagnosis. They are divorced from the literary origins of the word, which are in the city of Lviv. In late 19th century, Leopold von Sacher-Masoch was writing Venus in Furs in Lviv. He was the son of a police officer. And it was said he viewed quite a lot of violence on the streets of Lviv, probably not unlike what you see in Kadana's paintings, because that era in Galicia was not a multicultural, joyful place, as we would like to look back and imagine it in the Polish national myth. There was quite a lot of tension. And we see that in Schultz. We see him often on the streets in his other drawings with Jewish men and women, and they are separate from the rest of society. He was marginalized in some senses, but in other ways he was very much appreciated throughout the world. He gained fame in his lifetime. He was communicating with the Polish author Stanisław Witkacy and Gombrowicz. He was invited to Paris and London. His paintings, his drawings were shown in New York, but he never wanted to leave Drohobycz. It was his source of inspiration. And Jerzy Ficowski has written quite a lot about this in a recent book published in 2015. But back to Leopold von Sacher-Masoch. He was born in 1863. And he was known for his novel, Venus in Furs. He was also an ethnographer. And he devoted his writing to the character and culture of Galicia. He also loved the provinces in this way. And although he was very different from Schultz, he also formulated a theory of composition, of writing, that was rooted in the mythic origin of language. He said the truly significant author will always, like Aristophanes, Dante, Cervantes, Molière, and Goethe, prefer to represent human failure. It is a case of 3 cheers for fairy tales and down with those who describe the moral situation and who demand reform. So Masik's emphasis on human failure was, like Schultz, an attempt to demask reality. Schultz and Gombrowicz and Witkowski were always writing and speaking about masks, about taking familiar forms or archetypes and deforming them, about showing decay and transformation. Unlike Schultz, Masik plots history chronologically, and he ties the fate of man to a hand of a line of writers who lead the way forward. He's very much thinking about progress. Schultz was the better writer of the two. Writing becomes, however, in Masik an obligation because his contract he wrote between himself and his mistress, Pani Pistor, was his thinking of Masikism. It's very interesting text if you go and look at it, because there he is saying she should harm him, whip him, hurt him every day, but give him 4 hours for his writing. He gets 4 hours to write, and probably in this text you can see the writing is equally filled with pain. So both Schultz and Masik are similar in this sense. They are submitting themselves to their text. They feel a complete lack of wholeness, and they are early modernists in this way. Throughout Europe you have Nietzsche and others with the same break from the wholeness of the lyricism, of romanticism, and the nation. The nation is falling apart. People are traveling by train, moving quickly throughout the world, and there is not a sense of that province that they were both living in and trying to document as it was disappearing. So, discussing Witkewicz's novel, Означені, the literary scholar David Goldfarb, who I mentioned, uses Gilles Deleuze's interpretation of Masikism as a structural contract to show how the novelist is situating literature in this domination and submission. Witkowski's Masikism is a way, Goldfarb writes, of achieving the sublime, of reaching the metaphysical feeling of pure form in art. In this approach to Masikism, writers, artists become those who are transcending some kind of material world, in this view. But I depart from Goldfarb, because I think Schultz and Kadaň are not about transcendence. I think that they are more about a disregard for trusting words and images. They ask us to be maybe cynical for good reason, because the subject of violence is so present in each of these works that we have to think of them almost as though through a lens. We have to imagine that these pictures of Kadaň are in the past, that the violence is gone, that sexual violence is located in a spontaneous pogrom that is over and now we have moved on. But I think the situation is actually contemporary. The visibility of form and matter is, can we go to the next slide? Is so much about the material world, but violence is also symbolic. And I think this image here of Bruno Schulz, this self-portrait on the cover of the book of idolatry, which we've been viewing images of, tells a lot of, through the image shows us very clearly that what he's worshiping is not a woman, it's a book. Throughout all of these images, inside of the story, inside the frame of the book of idolatry, the idol is language. It's not flesh. And language is the way out. Language is for Schulz, and I think in showing us so many images of victims and perpetrators that are both unnamed, we have a responsibility in Kadan's images to give these images a language. So Schulz's theory on form, and the title of this talk is Against Form, it was really about diffusing language beyond its limits so that it's never frozen into one shape. He used the figure of a mannequin to describe this, a mannequin. In Taylor's dummies, or mannequins, he's talking about bodies as though they've been frozen into plastic, and this is a great tragedy, that they will never live or breathe. And for him, the book was like this. The book is a postulate, he wrote. The book is a goal. The artist grows, this is his words, and I really like this quote. The artist grows in proportion to his book. It's the process, and when it ends, it's a tragedy. Let's go to the next slide. We've already seen this quote, so let's go to the next one. Yep. This is one of the photographs from the image in this room of the pogrom, not far from the Brzydki prison. Let's go to the next image. And here's the painting of that same image. Many of the women in the pogrom were brought to the NKVD murder sites not to work. The men were brought there to work. The women were brought there just to be abused. And some of them were released and shortly then captured and kidnapped. So women played in this violence, I think even more symbolic, heavily symbolic role, because they were simply there to be targeted. They were raped. There were famous cases of different instruments being shoved into their vaginas. Very brutal, disgusting acts of torture targeting their bodies. Let's go to the next slide. For Schulz, the original myth was already buried. Though infinite, it proceeded by language. His texts never stood as finished things. So the women in the city of the Beef prior to this, which he's showing here, are empowered. They are not victimized. And the role reversal between the language in this image and the languages of the images that you see on the walls, between women being completely subjugated versus the men being subjugated, is carried through the line. The lines meaning the sketches, the style, the stylistic quality of an image that is moving always is important because Schulz's sketches connect with his thinking around writing and language as moving. And Kadan's work is also moving. It's not a frozen photograph. It's not evidence. It is signed. The images may be unnamed, but they are not unsigned. As soon as you enter into a photograph, a rendering by an artist's hand, you are connecting that rendering to the life and work of the artist. So we've spent a lot of time talking about Bruno Schulza, but we haven't spent a lot of time talking about Nікіти Кадана. His other works are important to read in the context of this exhibit because he is not a new artist. He's produced quite a bit of work. We can read themes throughout all of his pieces, and he has shown women's bodies in other contexts that align with the concept of freeing the body from being a fixed ideological site. So in Fixing, in his work called Fixing, he shows us Soviet architectural plans with women in poses from gymnastics manuals, Soviet-era athletic feats of achievement and exercises. So this is a quality or comment on totalitarian and different regimes, regulations of the body. And in my interpretation of those particular works of Nikita's, I think the architectural plans are very much connected to how space is divided, public space versus private space, and reproduction being legislated through that division. Virginia Woolf was writing quite a bit about this in her essay, A Room of One's Own. There's a lot of great work in gender studies about emancipating women from the home and into the factory, and we all have encountered those ideological narratives and their limits. So I think if we go to the next slide, I think if we return to Schulz for a moment and Jerzy Fitzowski's wonderful criticism, he's a scholar of Schulz, art erects temples for a deity that treats art with scorn. So art is synthetic. Art is part of a system that an artist builds through their life and through their works. And in the sense of scorn, this emotional quality of Schulz's work being positioned in the beginning of the 20th century in the modernist era where deconstruction was a new phenomenon. This is what he's getting at with the idea of scorn, that art cannot be captured, it is still interpretive and relative. In the sense, he is very much a modern artist, Nікіти Кадана is very much a postmodern artist citing a modernist period. So he uses the forms from the early 20th century throughout all of his works, some of them very disconnected geographically, but always temporally returning to the era of the 20s and the 30s. Let's go to the next slide. So this, in Bruno Schulz's essay, The Mythologizing of Reality, he lays out his philosophy of language that I've been talking about, but let's read through this quote. This thousand-formed, but integral organism of the word was torn apart into syllables, sounds, everyday speech, and in these new forms, adapted to practical needs, it was handed down to us as a handy code of communication. In this way, the life of the word, its development, was shunted onto a new track, the track of mundane life, and subjected to new rules of order. So here, he's describing in words what we've been looking at in terms of the body. That the body can be regulated just like language can be regulated into a code of communication, reduced down into a track. He uses this word track. I think that the unarchiving of the moment of 1941 is part of undoing the track, of not allowing for a single code of communication about that moment of the violence. Another way of asking this question is, what language do these paintings speak? We have on the walls here English, Polish, Hebrew, Ukrainian, Russian, all of these languages, and more Yiddish, were part of this soundscape of Lviv. And words, images, sounds from that soundscape have been lost. And I think what is wonderful about this exhibit is the sensorial, with the sounds of the action in Germany that plays on the speakers and the visuals. We have this synesthesia effect that starts to happen. Synesthesia meaning we see things or hear things that aren't there. We can't quite locate ourselves. The terrain is black, the horizon is almost invisible. We are submerged into the world of memory. And as soon as the world of memory meets with the world of politics, we have the possibility of this track, this code of communication that limits us to thinking only in a certain mechanic or manipulated way. And that's why I will, before we turn to questions and answers, once more revisit where we started, which was this national sensorium and the idea of banality. That in everyday objects, language we speak, the pictures we see on Facebook or the internet, we are building our own myth of ourselves, of which nation we belong to, which civic group we identify with, and in this sense, there is a lot of danger, because in 1993, the scholar Michael Bellick coined this term banal nationalism based on Hannah Arendt's idea of the banality of evil. These are habits that we repeat over and over again that provide some mental comfort or wiring that can be switched on to ignite some nationalist reactions. And it's when this banality becomes so automatic that a mass violence becomes a risk. We still have ethnic cleansing happening around the world. We have pogroms happening still. In my country, in the United States, there was just a mass shooting at a synagogue. And I am extremely filled with tragedy for that. And I think what we have to include in our national sensorium is the possibility for revolt. Aesthetic revolt, meaning disagreeing completely with what maybe is automatic, not allowing some sense of comfort to drive us, but to always be uncomfortable. And these paintings by Kadana, I've thought a lot about them in the context of all of the art I've seen in Poland around the Holocaust. I've been studying the Polish context for many years, and I don't think these could ever exist in Poland, because they don't fit. Yes.
Вопрос.
Yeah.
Скажите, пожалуйста, фотографии, которые у вас были, которые демонстрировали, как и работы, да? Я прошу прощения. Вы демонстрировали работы и так называемый львовский...
Из наушников ей не переводят.
Львовский погром, как такое, да? Скажите, пожалуйста, вы ориентировались на то, какая оккупационная власть была на данный тот момент? Вы мне не могу говорить. Я на вас реагирую, а на нее.
Она не слышит, алло, она не слышит, у нее нет переводчика.
Я повторю.
Она не слышит, не понимает.
Скажите, пожалуйста, вот этот львовский погром.
Да.
43-й год. Какая на тот момент существовала оккупационная власть, да, при которой это было, существовало такого? И под вопрос, на ваш взгляд, возможно ли это в наше время? Да?
I am thinking about the level of violence that exists in many places of the world. I'm not thinking about Lviv. And I would say it's very possible, in my own context, I have witnessed unbelievable things in the last 5 years, Nazi groups marching on the streets, using the symbols of this moment. And that's why I make that statement, because there seems to be uncritical use of symbols that stand for targeting of an ethnic other. Thank you for your question. Yes. I want to just conclude really quickly, and then we'll move to more questions, because I really want to hear what everybody has to say. So the last point I wanted to make was that I don't think I would ever see these pictures in the Polish context of art, because they don't fit with the idea of multiculturalism and loss. They are too radical, which I appreciate, because they have revolted against the Polish sensorium of loss, bringing back the Jew, the multicultural Poland will rise again if everybody, kind of follows this logic of nostalgia. Here we see a warning. And Kadana has given us a gift by putting, as I said before, women into the paintings as well. We see here today, I think these bodies could be viewed, if we change the context a little bit, in many different parts of the world right now that are experiencing violence and conflict, including Eastern Ukraine, including Afghanistan, many places. So
The west of Ukraine. Давайте с этого.
the unnamed is also the event. Not only the people, but the event can be unnamed, can be, really. But in that sense, we have a responsibility as an audience. We have to not assume anything about the paintings that, we have to bring to them a critical lens that gives dignity, and I use this word deliberately, it gives dignity to each of the people in them. And I have not talked about perpetrators today. I focus only on victims because I don't see any women perpetrators in the paintings. Surely there were women collaborating, but overwhelmingly men were carrying out the violence because of the structure of the military obviously being male at this time in history. But there has been new writing, very good, interesting writing by scholars looking at perpetrators. Lynn Viola is one who just wrote about officers working at this time and how they were recruited and what struggles they had also in how they, mentally were suffering. So that is, we don't want to perpetrate the perpetrator. We don't want to repeat their acts of targeting, but we also have to come to terms with the fact that this is part of what people do to each other. And that's why I think it's great that we are faced so brutally with the images here. It's not about some kind of other place, some lost victim that needs to return. It's right here in front of us. It's part of who we are. So that is my conclusion for today, but I really want to hear from you. So
Thank you, Jessica, for your lecture. Вы можете задавать вопросы. Прошу брать микрофон.
Thank you for your lectures. You really helped me to think about the very important question, especially in our land where we have long history of violence, how to depict the violence. Because we have, on one hand, we have like Susan Sontag regarding the pain of others, when she has this unfinished question. On one hand, we see too much violence on the depictions, and we begin to get to it. We begin to, eating our breakfast when we look in violence on the television. On the other hand, we have these linguistic positions, for example, Lacan, who speaks that the symbolic as a language prepares the body, and we came sorry for my English, and we go away from reality. Reality is this total violence, total pain, something that we never touch. And this is a very big question you make me to say, so it was just my try to say thank you, and maybe I want to ask you again how we should depict violence correctly. Thank you.
thank you. That is very interesting fact you brought up, Susan Sontag, because when I was teaching this past year at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, my students read many texts about violence and visual depiction, and I gave them the assignment to write their own visual narrative and to define a community through this narrative, however they want to define the community. And almost all of them cited Susan Sontag. And they kept citing this quote from an interview called How to Tell a Story. And Susan Sontag says in this quote, she asks, how do you choose whose story to tell? Do some people deserve to be in the story more than other people? this is the beginning of every story, this question. And I think my reply to your question is who becomes visible. That I think becoming visible is oftentimes the first step to depicting or undoing violence. A lot of violence is symbolic and invisible, and to do something correctly maybe isn't the approach to bringing something invisible into view. So finding what is missing, I think, is the first way to depict violence. And I really like the fact you brought up that we are assimilating violence into ourselves. We are becoming desensitized, especially in the media environment, which we see, I think, 1,000 images a day on social media and everything. And to slow down that consumption can be very, I think, helpful in learning how to tell a story.
So slow down and find the opposite. So let me summarize your answer. Am I correct? To slow down and find the missing point of what was depicted before, yes?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Two questions. First is Bruno Schulz, in his agent, there is no violence at all. Irony, yes. Sarcasm, a lot of, but no violence. And here is just violence. So it's really interesting to how you compare or whatever. It's the first question.
I think it depends on your critique, because in his writing, he's writing a lot about trapping words as a form of violence, like killing monsters under his pen. So this may be more violent and less ironic than his images of women, because I think he loves to write. And despite killing these monsters under his pen, which are figurative, in his drawings, the women are standing in for the book. So he's engaging with it. He's not killing women, he's not allowing them to kill him, but the men in his drawings are extremely, let's look back at them actually. They're suffering. To the Undula and the artists. This one, the next one. This one, look back. This one is good, yeah. So you can see the men are half beast.
They should be there.
So I don't know, that's what I would say. Yes, it's ironic, it's a cartoon, and it's part of this cabaret culture as well at that time in Lviv. I mean, there was a lot of, in the Street of Crocodiles, it was a boom town. This was a town of oil production, of costumes, there was money, there was also poverty. So, I don't know, it's more of a stage production here, I think. Yeah.
The second one is that we are here because we are living in the country where is a war, terrible war. Every day Ukrainians are killed. For us it's a tragedy, every day. And you mentioned that, just Afghanistan. And for us, this picture, it's more dealing to the nowadays and Ukraine.
I mentioned East Ukraine before Afghanistan. Yes, and I mentioned Afghanistan to refer to my own subject position, because I do not acquit the United States of being of not committing violence around the world. That's why I mentioned that gift. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
One more question.
Скажите, пожалуйста, ну, все, что сейчас происходит, допустим, в искусстве, ну, кино, к примеру, да, это, в принципе, ну, как, ну, если с позиции просто Фрейда рассматривать, то это такая пропаганда лагерного насилия, ну, скажем так. Скажите, пожалуйста, то, что, о чем вы говорите, это декларация или это констатация?
A declaration or a statement. I would say both. I would say that in response to both of your comment as well about the war that is taking place, означені can also mean how lives are valued by different states and regimes and also disvalued and thrown away.
Yeah.
And that some times and places the unnamed go unburied, and this was a moment where they were unburied and not given any honor. I would be completely the opposite. So I think that is the statement. That would be my statement. So.
One moment.
Спасибо.
Can you tell us, you know, other examples of
Ближе.
Ukrainian artists exploring the theme of violence in contemporary Ukraine?
Она не знает.
I should ask you this question, actually.
If you know.
Она не знает.
In contemporary Ukraine.
Она не знает. Не обругайте.
In the context, actually, that I came to know of Kadan's work was working on a book discussing art between the years 2004 and 2014. So this period between the Orange Revolution and the Maidan Revolution of Dignity is the period that I'm most familiar with. And I would say that all artists I've been looking at in this time are dealing with censorship as this form of key form of violence in their art. And I would name all of the artists in the Proekt group that Nikita's a part of, around Kuznetsov's trial, looking at the attack on him in Mistetsky Arsenal and his art as a key example for them. And if we walk backwards to right after the Orange Revolution, where that group started was really about the square, the public square, and the right to speak, and how to shape the limits of, or what is censorship and what is free speech and what is propaganda. So that's the media violence, I think, is also a part of that. Yeah.
Your question. Natasha, your question.
Your opinion about why gender is so scared term to traditionalist, nationalist, neo-Nazis, etc. Why are they so scared about that term?
Yeah, great question. In 2013, the number one phrase in Polish media was "stop gender," "stop gender," as though you could stop this gender. That is a good question. I think because it involves the most basic system of organizing in society, human relations, sexual relations, and gender performance, gender roles. As soon as you start to allow for everyone to express themselves and not fit into the mechanisms of control, then it's emancipation. Emancipation is scary for anybody seeking control if that's how we define a nationalist, as somebody who's seeking, a totalitarian or not totalitarian, what I'm trying to say.
They're scared of freedom, or what?
Yeah. It could be. Everybody is scared of freedom, I think. Everybody is scared. Ultimate freedom is terrifying, but I think that we should not draw us and them boundaries too much if we can. Invite people who we disagree with into a dialogue or conversation without endangering ourselves, then we've already made progress.
The second scariest word is tolerance after gender.
Yeah. And according to you, why not the first? Why is not the second?
I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about
society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I speak loud enough, I think.
Any questions? Yeah.
To sum with the previous question, we also have the long story of depicting, female bodies not only in pictures of violence, but in everyday culture. Some ways they are over-sexualized, some ways they are desexualized, for example, like in some parts of Soviet art. Some ways they are idealized, like you show us. So my question is this only about female body, or we have some story of this changing of the concept of male body and male sexuality? We have a lot of information about female, and I always was interested why we have less information about this male changing in the history of art. Just question to you because it's your topic.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think more work on masculinity should certainly happen. There's a lot of work about soldiers right now in Ukraine, and if you are interested, tomorrow's webinar has written about this actually. For the past 10 years, she's been looking at masculinity as well as ideas of femininity. I think in art, though, the reason there's so much emphasis on the female nude, going back to, Greek ideas of beauty and Platonic ideals, that is part of why I think there is a lot more writing about that. But yeah, advertising is another domain of violence. Depictions of women's bodies in advertising is certainly part of this erasure of the individual and just a dehumanization, creating an objectification of women and men, objectification. It harms everybody, definitely. Yeah.
Could I add something to because me, I'm in trousers, but I'm female creature. And we, Ukrainian women, we always protest that artists present just female bodies. And all of them ask you, why you never present male body? And even I ask to present, we female creatures, we need to see you nude. Why you present us to us? We need. So it was a great question.
It's a good point.
Yeah, we are tired to see it us. Yeah.
And not every sexy man has to look like Michelangelo. Come on.
Yeah.
There's a lot of variety, a lot left to explore. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Any more?
I think the last question, maybe, yeah? Before last.
Да, эмансипация это прекрасно, и мы поддерживаем эмансипацию. Скажите, пожалуйста, вот когда все-таки отменят, скажем так, и применят эмансипацию в самом главном культурном движении человечества, как Олимпийские игры, и, допустим, футбольная команда, не важно, и женщины будут просто претендовать на, вот реально, на прямые позиции с мужчинами, да? Вы себя, чисто так, физиологически, конкретно, даже несмотря на это, мы же потеряем целые виды спорта. Потому что будут просто команда, допустим, определенной страны, без женской команды. Потому что они не попадут, просто по физическим каким-то характеристикам, они не попадут. Просто не из-за гендерного какого-то. Есть ли предел желанию женщин?
Не надо извиняться, надо забрать.
I have two answers. One is that there are many different types of sports and many bodies that can do many things. So why limit ourselves?
Вы имеете в виду, как это, фигурное катание?
Well, okay, this also brings up one important point, which is that today in Schultz's work, we see two genders, male and female, but there are more genders. There are many more genders. And there are sports that haven't been invented yet. So hopefully in the future we will have lots of creative, open pathways
Я за
for all
симбиоз.
genders.
Я за симбиоз.
Все,
Все окей. Джессика, большое спасибо тебе за лекцию.
Thank you.
Было очень все, что происходит сегодня, и выставка, и лекционная программа, это произошло благодаря финансированию нашего работодателя, фонда «Лекторки». Спасибо, и приходите, пожалуйста.